Avatar: The Last Airbender has got to be one of my all-time favorite shows. I originally watched it as a kid on the verge of my teenage years, like I'm sure many of you did. You'd think that after growing up and becoming an adult, the shows you watched as a kid would grow stale or age poorly. Some of them do, of course, but Avatar never has. It still holds up remarkably well and is probably my second most rewatched show next to Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. Well, I recently watched it again when I made that Zuko video of mine a while back. This was also the first time rewatching the show since I became a practicing Stoic. Due to being in such a different place in my life than I was the first time I watched it, I naturally made some new connections and had some novel insights this time around. What struck me is that the Avatar characters map quite well to some of the Stoic teachings I've been studying, specifically the Four Virtues of Stoicism. So in the short video, I'd like to take the time to go over the Four Virtues and examine how they map to some of the characters in the show I've loved for years. This isn't a preaching video, or at least I'm not trying to make it a preaching video. These are values and beliefs that I and other Stoics hold, but I try not to enforce my beliefs on anyone else. If you're not a Stoic, you don't have to abide by Stoic teachings. But if you find something that does resonate with you, then you're more than welcome to apply it to your life. Stoicism is a life philosophy, not a religion. You are welcome to use certain tools in the philosophy if it benefits you. In fact, I encourage it. Anyway, on to the Four Virtues. The four Stoic virtues come from the doctrine in Stoicism that teaches us that in order to live a proper and fulfilled life, you should act according to nature. This doesn't mean you should go out and hug a tree, but rather that we recognize two fundamental truths. The first is that humans are social animals. We form strong bonds with other members of our tribe, and we place emphasis on acting in good faith towards the people who we are close with. And while we can act in antisocial ways, we are ultimately best served by acting in a pro-social way, since we've evolved to thrive in social environments. The second truth is that humans are unique in that we are animals that are capable of reason. We are able to rationalize and understand the cause and effect of events in order to better make sense of the world we find ourselves in. This doesn't mean that we can't act irrationally and without reason, far from it. But what it does mean is that we are the animals on Earth uniquely capable of using our faculties of reason to do incredible things. Other animals got fangs, claws, muscle and the like, while we got our brains. The conclusion then is that we should use our rationality to improve our social situation, meaning that acting according to nature means using reason and rationality to improve the lives of ourselves, others, and the human race in general. We should act well towards our fellow humans and also find ways to better cooperate with them to strive towards a better future. How do we do this? The Stoics believed that the best way to achieve this was to act with virtue. Basically, by always acting in accordance with the four virtues, we would be using our reason to improve the lives of ourselves and others. The virtues, then, are the guiding principles that should dictate our actions. So, what are these virtues? They are fairly simple, and I'll briefly explain them here. The first virtue we'll cover is the virtue of wisdom. Wisdom here doesn't mean the wisdom you find in old men who have lived interesting lives, or at least not necessarily. It's a more practical wisdom that helps guide us to choose the best action in any given situation. If a problem or an event presents itself, wisdom is what tells us what the best course of action to deal with that problem or event is. Wisdom teaches us to consider things in a wider context so that you don't make decisions based on the spur of the moment or limited information. You might ask what criteria we should use to guide this practical wisdom, but that's where the other virtues come in. The next virtue is the virtue of temperance. Temperance is basically another word for self-control or moderation. The Stoics believe that it is best for us to avoid excess in any situation, both in the positive or negative. So while it's usually good advice to avoid getting overly angry, it's also good advice not to be overcome by other passions like happiness. It may sound strange to say you shouldn't be too happy, but you'd be surprised how even positive emotions can completely blind us to important factors for consideration. Romeo and Juliet, for example, is the story of a love so strong that it blinded them to the possible ramifications of their union to the point that multiple people died. Temperance teaches us to control ourselves in terms of emotion as well as physical pleasures or vices like drinking, eating, sex, etc. The next virtue is the virtue of justice. Justice is a virtue that teaches us to always treat others with fairness. It doesn't teach us to treat each person equally because every person is unique with their own individual circumstances that need to be considered. But it does teach us to treat them with fairness and to treat others as we wish to be treated. We judge others based on their own actions and not the actions of their friends, family, or ancestors. And when we deem someone to have done something wrong, we don't let them off lightly because they're a friend or become extra harsh because they're a stranger or foe. It also teaches us to regulate our own behavior so that we don't treat others unjustly by, for example, lying or cheating them. And when we've done something wrong, we should immediately confess and seek to right the wrong we've caused. The final virtue is the virtue of courage. This is probably the most crucial virtue of all. Courage teaches us to face our fears even when we're quaking in our boots. It teaches us to stand up for what is right, even when doing so is difficult or inconvenient. It is also the virtue from which the others spring. You can only practice wisdom if you have the courage to face your own biases and are willing to question your own worldview on a regular basis. You can only practice temperance if you have the courage to say no to temptation or vice, but to also face the things that would otherwise be uncomfortable to deal with. You can only practice justice if you have the courage to face injustices in the world and say no. Justice is only possible if you're willing to stand up for yourself, others, and to hold yourself to account when you mess up, all of which require courage. Courage is ultimately the core virtue, but is not more important than the others. These virtues are the guiding principles for Stoic action, and I believe each one is exemplified in a character from Avatar: The Last Airbender. Sure, you could arguably find examples in each character for all the virtues, but I think that certain characters exemplify a single virtue above others. So while I could take a character and show how they embody each virtue, I think it works better for demonstrative purposes if I look at the main virtue each character embodies. Before we begin looking at characters though, I need to clarify something. I will not be putting Uncle Iroh in this list. Not because he isn't a great character, because he is, but because he embodies each virtue so well and fully that the demonstration would become a bit muddied. He is like a Stoic sage who embodies all the virtues almost perfectly, but that makes it difficult to point to a single one he exemplifies to make examples of. So I'm giving him an honorable mention here since he is technically the most virtuous character, but I do need some contrast for the purposes of this video and thus will be using other characters instead. Don't blame me, blame Iroh for being too perfect for the video. Anyway, the first virtue we'll look at is the virtue of wisdom, and I'm sure you can already guess which character from Team Avatar embodies this trait the best. I believe it should come as no surprise when I say that Aang is the epitome of wisdom within the Avatar group. He not only waits and thinks his actions through, he also generally makes the best decision based on the circumstances. Now, I'm not saying he's perfect in this regard, and there are definitely times where his wisdom is lacking and where he makes the wrong call. But compared to some of the other members of Team Avatar, he definitely makes the right call most of the time. It's clear that his time with the monks cultivated within him a deep sense of wisdom and practical knowledge. If, for example, we look at one of his most important decisions, we'd see just how wise he is. I'm talking, of course, about his battle with Fire Lord Ozai. Yes, he originally made the decision because he did not want to take a life, but the choice was also wise for a lot more reasons. For one, consider that Fire Lord Ozai is the ruler of a very nationalist empire. He has subjects that are utterly devoted to him and will risk their lives for any cause he deems necessary. Yes, he's an evil megalomaniac, but that doesn't change the fact that his people were absolutely devoted to him. If Aang killed him, how much destruction and turmoil do you think there would have been within the Fire Nation? To the people, it would look like the Fire Lord's son, who was banished, joined the enemy and helped kill his own father for power. And for good measure, they also took care of Azula, the one the Fire Lord named his true heir. Say what you want, but this would have been a recipe for disaster in a geopolitical context. There's actually a lot of good reasons not to outright kill the Fire Lord beyond just extreme pacifism. Katara, Aang's love interest, told him it's a better idea to kill Ozai. Zuko, the firstborn son of Ozai, said Aang should kill the Fire Lord. Even Aang's past lives told him it's best if he killed Ozai. But he had ethics and morals that told him not to do it. He knew that killing the Fire Lord wasn't the right move. And instead of caving into pressure, he found his own way to deal with the problem whilst also sticking with his own principles. Through practical wisdom, Aang found a way to make the best decision given the circumstances, even when that decision was difficult and unpopular. I went back and forth on whether or not to put temperance under Katara. Temperance is the virtue of self-control, moderation, and the avoidance of excess in both good or bad things. I could easily make the case that temperance also fits with other characters, but I believe that Katara suits it best. And like I said with Aang, it doesn't mean that she has perfect self-control. She definitely has times where she doesn't control herself very well and where she goes overboard. But on the whole, I do believe she best exemplifies this virtue. The most striking example is, of course, the day she confronts her mother's murderer. I think this is the ultimate example of self-control within the series. Think about it for a moment. Almost her whole life has been defined by this one thing. Yes, she's a sister and a waterbender. Yes, she's a citizen of the Southern Water Tribe and a member of Team Avatar. But the one event in her life that had the most impact on her was the day that the Fire Nation attacked her tribe and killed her mother. It's the day she remembers the most, and it's the day that was the biggest turning point in her life. And then she finally gets the chance to confront the man that did it. Not the man that ordered it, not the man that follows the orders for it. No, this is the man that went out, decided to kill her mother, and actually went through with it. What's worse, it happened because her mother was protecting her from being discovered as the last waterbender in the tribe. The emotional weight of the scene cannot be emphasized enough. But what does she do? Does she kill him like she planned? Does she hurt him for some kind of revenge? Does she in some small way make him pay for the pain he caused? No, she lets him live. She realizes that killing him isn't worth sacrificing her own morality. She says she'll never forgive him, and you can understand why, but she spares his life. She looks at him and decides that he's a pathetic and empty monster of a man. His life is punishment enough. Her self-control in that moment is legendary. She literally had him on the ground with spikes of ice ready to skewer him, and instead of violence, she chose to control herself and let him go. Not because she was weak or lacked the will to do it, but because she was strong enough not to succumb to her baser impulses. I challenge you to find another example of a character that demonstrates this much self-control, because I certainly can't think of one. Justice is a difficult one because it's a word that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But like I said earlier, we're looking specifically at a sense of justice that teaches us to always treat others with fairness. It doesn't teach us to treat each person equally because every person is unique with their own individual circumstances that need to be considered. But it does teach us to treat them with fairness and to treat others as we wish to be treated. We judge others based on their own actions and not the actions of their friends, family, or ancestors. Based on this definition, I believe that Zuko is the best representative of justice in the Avatar team. And the moment that defines him in that respect has got to be the epic scene where he finally stands up to his father. This is the single moment where Zuko finally stood up for true justice instead of believing in his own deluded narrative. For his whole life, Zuko has been seeking the approval of his father. He has wished for his father's praise at every turn, but that praise never came. And when he was banished, all he could think about was regaining his honor in order to win his father's approval back. He overlooked all the pain his people and his family had caused. What the Fire Nation did was justified. What his father did was justified. What anyone did in the name of his worldview, whether it's for the Fire Nation or for his father's approval, was justified. This is a common narrative today, that the ends justify the means. That it's fine if we act out with injustice as long as it leads to a sense of justice we agree with. That's where Zuko once was before he came to his senses. After dealing with all the trauma, guilt, and struggles of what was thrown his way, he finally said enough is enough. He finally stood up for what he believed was right. He stood up to his abusive father for the first time in his life. He abandoned his family and his own country because he could no longer abide by their atrocities. he made the choice to do what was right, to treat all people fairly. He realized it wasn't fair for his nation to subjugate other people. He realized it wasn't fair for his father to treat him this way. He realized it wasn't fair to the world if he let the Avatar face his father without all the help he could get. So he took the situation into his own hands. He stood his ground and acted with justice in the best way he knew how, by giving all his support and energy to the Avatar, to seek to restore the balance to the world because it was the right thing to do. Zuko chose justice because he was tired of living in an unjust world, but justice cannot get you anywhere if you're too afraid to stand up for it. You must be willing to face difficulties if you wish to fix any problems in the world. What you need, of course, is courage. When I was thinking through all the characters I could use for the virtue of courage, Sokka was the last one on my mind. Not that I dislike him as a character, in fact he is one of my top favorites, but I was purely thinking of benders within the universe, so Sokka just never occurred to me while I was coming up with the concept for this video. Then I realized that the fact that he's not a bender is exactly the reason why Sokka is the perfect character for this virtue. He's the only non-bender in a group full of benders. He doesn't have super powerful abilities to help him get out of tough situations. He doesn't have advanced techniques to deal with people who can shoot fire and lightning at him. Despite that, however, he still faces his enemies head on. Sokka is the most underpowered character, but he's the one who's willing to fight to the last moment. He's the one who infiltrated a maximum security prison for the chance at saving his father, even though he had no initial plan of escape. He's the one who set up the invasion plan even though this was the first time so much was relying on him. He learned how to fight with the sword and then faced his own teacher in what he assumed was a fight to the death when his identity was revealed. Like I said earlier, the virtue of courage teaches us to face our fears even when we're quaking in our boots. It teaches us to stand up for what is right even when doing so is difficult or inconvenient. To be the only non-bender in a conflict of extremely powerful benders requires a lot of a person. And to be that person whilst also trying to prove your worth in the group by being the tactician and the guy who keeps everyone's spirits up is a massive feat in and of itself. I could take a moment to expand on a specific scene like I did for the other characters where I explain how Sokka properly displayed the virtue of courage, but I don't think that's necessary. Sokka displays courage all the time. Think back to the beginning of the entire series where Zuko attacked his tribe. Sokka faced down an invading force of firebenders on his own, even though he was totally outmanned and outmatched. And his displays of courage only increased from there. And like I said earlier, courage is also the virtue from which the others spring. Courage is ultimately the core virtue, but is not more important than the others. But thanks to Sokka's courage, you can actually find instances where he also displays other important virtues purely because he has the courage to do so. Sokka may not be the most powerful character in the group, but I'd argue that he's definitely the most courageous. I wanted to spend a short moment mentioning something important about the virtues. I've been talking about them as if they are these four separate things that can guide your actions, and they certainly are. But the virtues are also interlinked and can't really be separated from one another. Each virtuous action will include all four virtues to varying degrees. You can't really find a virtuous action that is comprised only of a single virtue. All virtuous actions are comprised of all four virtues. Picture a table. Each virtue is one of the legs of the table, so each one is important and separate in its own way. But if you take one of the legs away, the table becomes very unstable and not really useful in any practical sense of the word. The same goes for the virtues. You need all four in order to live a truly virtuous life. If, for example, your boss is yelling at a coworker, you must employ all virtues to deal with the situation. First of all, you must employ justice to know that you must stand up for your colleague. Courage is what actually lets you take action despite the potential consequences. You must also employ wisdom to know how to best approach the situation. And temperance helps you regulate your response so that you don't go overboard or do too little. All four virtues are important. But on a deeper level, they are also interlinked. So let's say you respond to your boss in that situation. Justice says that you should stand up for your colleague if your boss is unfairly yelling at them. But do you punch your employer or just mumble under your breath? Temperance would say that you shouldn't go as far as punching, but that mumbling is not doing enough. Wisdom is knowing which response is actually appropriate, and courage is actually being willing to make the move that you've decided on. Each action requires all 4 virtues to work in unison. All the virtues are linked and require each other to operate optimally. They are 4 pillars of the same thing, 4 circles linked within each other, 4 parts of the same whole. Thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate all the time you've given me in watching the video. If you enjoyed it and would like to support the channel in some way, consider hitting the like button and subscribing, since that tells YouTube to promote and share this video with more people. Anyway, take care and we'll talk again very soon.